Helge Ingstad was obsessed with a ghost story. It was the 1950s, and the Norwegian explorer was consumed by the Icelandic sagas, ancient texts that told of Vikings sailing west from Greenland to a place they called Vinland. For centuries, most scholars dismissed these tales. They were myths, heroic fiction. But Ingstad believed they were history. He believed Vinland was a real place, a lost Norse settlement in North America, and he was going to find it. He and his wife, archaeologist Stine Ingstad, spent years searching. They sailed the coasts of Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Nova Scotia. They followed every false lead and every dead end. By 1960, they were in Newfoundland, Canada. They were tired. The search seemed hopeless. Then, they spoke to a fisherman in the small village of Meadows. His name was George Decker. He told them about an old Indian camp at a place called Apaves Bay. When the Ingstads arrived, they saw a series of faint, overgrown mounds on a flat marine terrace overlooking the strait. To an untrained eye, it was just lumpy ground covered in grass. But Anne Stine saw something else. She saw patterns. She saw the faint, rectangular outlines of buildings hidden beneath the sod. They were long and narrow, with straight walls and rounded corners. They looked exactly like the remains of Norse longhouses she had excavated in Greenland. The excavation began. It took 7 years of careful, painstaking work. Slowly, the earth gave up its secrets. They uncovered the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings. One was a great hall, with a central fire pit and sleeping platforms along the walls. Another was a smithy, a workshop for a blacksmith. They found the stone anvil he used and more than 100 pieces of slag, the waste product of forging iron. The local indigenous peoples of Newfoundland, the Beothuk, and their ancestors did not forge iron. Then came the smaller personal items. They found a bronze ring-headed pin, a type used by Norsemen, to fasten their cloaks. They found a bone needle and a small stone lamp. Most importantly, they found a spindle hurl made of soapstone. A spindle hurl is a weight used for spinning yarn. It was definitive proof that women were in this settlement, spinning wool in the Norse fashion. This was not a temporary camp for sailors. It was a home. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal and artifacts placed the settlement's occupation squarely between 990 and 1050 AD. This fit perfectly with the timeline of the sagas, which described Leif Eriksson's voyage around the year 1000. For nearly 1,000 years, Leif Erikson was a character in a story. After 1960, he was a historical figure. The ghost story was true. The mounds at Meadows were the physical proof of the first European settlement in the Americas, built 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. Number 20, the story was just a myth for almost 1,000 years. For centuries, the story of Vinland was just that, a story. It existed only on dried calfskin in 2 Icelandic manuscripts known as the sagas. There was the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red. They were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, a few hundred years after the events they described. They told of bold voyages, new lands, strange fruits, and violent encounters with a native people the Norse called Skrælings. To the academic world, these were folk tales. They were on par with stories of dragons and trolls. The idea that Vikings and their open longships could have crossed the treacherous North Atlantic to North America seemed impossible. The details in the sagas felt too fantastical. A land of self-sown wheat and vines that produced grapes? It sounded like a mythical paradise, not a real place. Historians in the 18th and 19th centuries largely dismissed it. They believed the Norse were capable sailors, yes, but crossing the Davis Strait into the unknown wilds of America was a leap too far. The sagas were studied for their literary value, for their window into the Viking mind, but not as historical documents. They were seen as a product of Icelandic pride, a nation on the edge of the world creating a heroic origin story for itself. There was no proof. No Norse ruins had ever been found in America. No Viking sword or helmet had ever been dug from Canadian or New England soil. There was nothing but the words on the page. A few romantics and amateur historians tried to prove the sagas were real. They pointed to the Kensington runestone found in Minnesota in 1898, which supposedly told of a Norse expedition in 1362. They pointed to the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a strange stone structure they claimed was a Viking watchtower. But these were all eventually debunked. The runestone was a clever forgery. The tower was the ruin of a 17th century windmill. Every piece of supposed evidence crumbled under scrutiny. These failures only hardened the academic consensus. Vinland was a fantasy. Even when the Ingstads began their search, they were seen as eccentrics chasing a dream. The established archaeological community was skeptical. Finding actual, verifiable Norse ruins felt as likely as finding Atlantis. The sheer vastness of the North American coastline made the task seem impossible. The sagas gave vague directions. Sail west from Greenland, find a land of flat stones, then a land of forests, then a land of vines. It could have been anywhere from Baffin Island to Long Island Sound. The discovery at Meadows changed everything overnight. It was like a bomb going off in the quiet halls of history. Suddenly, the sagas were not just literature, they were guidebooks. The impossible story was real. The details that seemed so fanciful were now clues. Helge and Stine Ingstad did more than excavate a site. They excavated a lost chapter of history. They proved that for nearly 1,000 years, the world had forgotten the truth. The first Europeans to see, to map, and to live in North America were not from Spain. They were from Iceland and Greenland, they were the Norse, and the stories they told were not myths. Both they were memories. Number 19, North America, was discovered by accident. The first European to see the shores of North America was not looking for them. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and he was a merchant captain from Iceland. He was a practical man, a trader, not an explorer. His life revolved around predictable sea lanes and the annual voyage between Iceland and Norway. It was a life of routine. Around the year 986 AD, that routine was broken. Bjarni returned to Iceland from a trading trip to Norway, expecting to spend the winter with his father Herjolf. But when he arrived, he found that his father was gone. He had sold his land and sailed away with a man named Erik the Red. They had gone to a new colony. Erik had founded in the west a place he called Greenland. Bjarni was a dutiful son, and he decided to follow his father. This was a bold decision. No one on his ship, including Bjarni himself, had ever sailed the Greenland Sea. They had no maps. They had no compass. All they had was a set of verbal instructions and the position of the sun and stars. They set sail from Iceland, heading west into the unknown. For 3 days, the weather was good. They made steady progress. Then the sky turned dark. The north wind began to howl, and a thick fog rolled in. For days, they were lost. They had no idea where they were or which direction they were sailing. They were completely at the mercy of the storm, tossed about in their small wooden ship in the vast, empty ocean. When the sun finally reappeared, they got their bearings, but they were disoriented. They continued sailing west. Soon they saw land, but it did not match the description of Greenland. The saga says it was a land covered in forests with low hills. It was not the land of mountains and glaciers they had been told to expect. Bjarni's crew wanted to go ashore. They were curious, they wanted to explore. Bjarni refused. He was not an adventurer, he was a man with a destination. His goal was to find his father in Greenland, not to chart new territory. He ordered his crew to turn the ship away from the shore and sail north. He was a man on a mission, and this strange new land was a distraction. They sailed for 2 more days and saw land again. This time, it was flat and heavily wooded. Again, it was not Greenland. Again, his crew begged to explore. And again, Bjarni said no. He would not even allow the ship to get close. He turned the ship to the northeast, sailing away from the coast with a southwest wind at their back. After 3 more days, they saw a third land. This one was high, mountainous, and topped with a glacier. This looked more promising, but it still didn't seem right. It looked too barren and inhospitable. Bjarni didn't go ashore. He sailed along the coast and realized it was an island. He turned his ship out to sea once more, leaving this new land behind. Finally, after 4 more days of hard sailing, they saw the familiar landscape they had been searching for. They saw the mountains and glaciers of Greenland. By sheer luck, they had found the exact settlement where his father lived. The Bjarni Herjolfsson had completed his journey. He told the story of the lands he had seen to the west. People were fascinated, but also critical. They criticized him for his lack of curiosity. He had seen new lands, something no one had ever done, and, he hadn't even bothered to step foot on them. He hadn't brought back any samples of wood or plants. He had no new information to offer beyond the fact that land was there. Bjarni, the practical merchant, had accidentally made one of the most significant discoveries in human history, and he had sailed right past it, but he had planted an idea. The story of the wooded lands to the west began to spread throughout the small colony of Greenland. It would be another man, Leif Erikson, who would decide to turn Bjarni's accident into a deliberate exploration. Number 18, they named the New World like a roadmap. When Leif Erikson decided to sail west, about 15 years after Bjarni's accidental sighting, he wasn't just exploring. He was retracing a path. He bought Bjarni's ship, hired a crew of 35 men, and set out to find the lands Bjarni had described. He found them, but in the reverse order, and as he explored each one, he gave it a name. These names were not poetic or grand. They were simple, practical, and descriptive. They were labels. Together they formed a kind of verbal map of the New World. The first land they reached was the last one Bjarni had seen. It was a bleak, desolate place. The sagas describe a landscape where glaciers dominated the inland areas, and the stretch from the ice to the sea was a single, vast slab of flat rock. There was no grass, no soil, nothing of value. It was a barren wasteland. Leif named it Helluland, which translates to Land of the Flat Stones, or Slab Land. He and his men went ashore, but they saw no reason to stay. Leif said that this land was as useless as Bjarni had been for not exploring. Today, most historians believe Helluland was Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. The description of a rocky, glaciated landscape fits perfectly. Leif and his crew sailed south. The next land they found was completely different. It was flat and wooded, with wide beaches of white sand. This matched Bjarni's second sighting. The endless forest stretched as far as the eye could see. For people living in Greenland, where trees were so scarce they had to rely on driftwood, this was an incredible sight. The most valuable resource here was obvious. It was the wood. Leif named this place Markland, which means forest land. This was a place of immense potential. It was a source of timber for building houses, ships, and tools. They went ashore briefly, then continued south. Markland is generally thought to be the coast of Labrador. They sailed on for 2 more days with a northeast wind. They found an island to the north of the mainland, went ashore, and then sailed through a strait between the island and a cape that jutted out from the mainland. They continued west around the cape. They found a river that flowed out from a lake. The tide was low, and their ship ran aground on the shoals. They were so eager to get to land that they left the ship and ran ashore. When the tide came in and refloated their ship, they sailed it up the river and into the lake, where they anchored. They decided to build a settlement here and spend the winter. The land was rich. The sagas say there was no lack of salmon in the river and the lake, and the salmon were bigger than any they had ever seen. The climate was mild. There was little frost in the winter, and the grass stayed green. And here they found the resource that would give the entire region its name. One day, a man from their crew, a German named Turker, went missing. They found him in the woods, excited and speaking in his native German. He had found something from his homeland. He had found grapes and vines. Leif Erikson, in light of this discovery, named the land Vinland, the L end of wine. Helluland, Markland, Vinland. It was a simple, descriptive progression from stone to wood to food. It was a map made of words, a guide for future voyages. It told sailors what to expect and what they could find. It was a practical naming system for a practical people, a people who saw the New World not as a place of wonder, but as a place of resources. Number 17, the first European settlement was a family business. The exploration of Vinland was not a royal or state-sponsored enterprise. It was the project of a single, powerful, and very difficult family, the children of Erik the Red. Erik himself was an outlaw. He was banished from Norway for manslaughter. He then settled in Iceland, but was banished from there too, also for killing. In 982 AD, he sailed west and found Greenland, establishing the first Norse colony there. He was a charismatic and ruthless leader. And his children inherited his ambition and his volatile nature. The first of his children to go to Vinland was his son, Leif Erikson. He was known as Leif the Lucky. He was intelligent, thoughtful, and a natural leader. Around the year 1000, he bought Bjarni Herjolfsson's boat and mounted the first deliberate expedition to the new lands. He established the settlement at Lonso's Meadows, spent one winter there, and returned to Greenland with a cargo of timber and grapes. And his voyage was a huge success. He became a wealthy and respected man. Leif's brother, Thorvald Eriksson, wanted his own taste of glory. He thought Leif had not explored the new land enough. Leif agreed to lend Thorvald his ship for a voyage to Vinland. Thorvald and his crew sailed to Leif's settlement, which was called Leifsbudir or Leif's Booths. They spent the winter there, living off the land. The next summer, Thorvald took a small party and explored the coast to the west. The summer after that, he explored to the east. It was here that they had the first contact with the native people, the Skraelings. The encounter turned violent. Thorvald was shot with an arrow and killed. He was the first European to die in North America. His men buried him there on a headland and then returned to Greenland with the grim news. Another of Erik's sons, Thorstein Eriksson, decided he must go to Vinland to retrieve his brother's body. He set out with his wife Gudrid and a crew of 25 men, but the voyage was a disaster. They were battered by storms all summer and never found Vinland. They were blown back and forth across the ocean and eventually landed back in Greenland at a different settlement just as winter was beginning. Well, a disease swept through the settlement that winter, and Thorstein died. The most ambitious Vinland expedition was led not by an Eriksson, but by an Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. He had married Gudrid, Thorstein's widow. Karlsefni was a wealthy and capable man, and he decided to attempt a true colonization of Vinland. Around 1010 AD, he organized a large expedition. It consisted of 3 ships and about 160 people, including women. They even brought livestock. Leif's half-sister, Freydis Erik's daughter, and her husband were also part of this expedition in their own ship. They settled at Leifsbudir and stayed for 3 years. It was during this time that Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri, the first European born in the Americas. But even this large-scale attempt was plagued by the family's difficult nature. The sagas tell of tension and conflict within the group, and their relations with the Skraelings eventually deteriorated into open warfare. The colony was no longer safe. After 3 years, Karlsefni and the others abandoned the settlement and returned to Greenland. The final Vinland voyage mentioned in the sagas was led by the most fearsome of Erik's children, Freydis Eriksdottir. And she was Erik's illegitimate daughter, and she had her father's temper. She organized an expedition with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helge and Finnbogi. They agreed to go as equal partners, each with 1 ship and 30 men, but Freydis was treacherous. She secretly took more people on her ship. Once in Vinland, at Leifsbudir, she instigated a conflict with the brothers. She lied to her husband, telling him the brothers had attacked her and demanded he kill them. Her husband and his men killed all the men in the brothers' party, but they refused to kill the 5 women. The saga says Freydis took up an axe herself and killed the 5 women. She then threatened to kill anyone who spoke of the massacre when they returned to Greenland. The Vinland venture, which began with Leif's successful exploration, ended in betrayal and murder driven by the dark ambition of Erik the Red's daughter. Number 16, they brought their cows with them. The journey to Vinland was not just about finding new land, it was about creating a new life, a new farmstead on the edge of the world. And for the Norse, a farm was not a farm without livestock. The expedition led by Thorfinn Karlsefni around 10 AD was a serious attempt at colonization. They didn't just bring tools and weapons, they brought a slice of their old world with them. They loaded their open-decked nars, their sturdy cargo ships, with cattle, sheep, and probably goats. This was an incredible undertaking. A nar was about 54 feet long and 15 feet wide. It was an open boat with only a small shelter at the stern and bow. The journey from the western settlement in Greenland to Meadows was roughly 2,000 miles. It would have taken weeks. The animals would have been tethered in the central, open part of the ship. They would have been exposed to the wind, the salt spray, and the violent pitching of the ship in the North Atlantic storms. Keeping them alive was a huge challenge. The settlers had to bring enough fodder and fresh water for the entire voyage for both the animals and the 160 or so people on board. Space was at a premium. Every bundle of hay, every barrel of water took up space that could have been used for other essential supplies. The animals would have been terrified, sick, and weak. Some likely did not survive the journey, but they were essential to the plan. The Norse were pastoralists. Their entire way of life was built around their animals. Cattle provided milk, butter, and cheese. They were a source of meat and leather. Their bones were used for tools and crafts. Their dung was used for fuel in a land that might not have enough firewood. A bull and a few cows were the nucleus of a new herd, the foundation of a permanent settlement. The sagas mention the livestock specifically. When the Skraelings first came to trade, they were fascinated by the Norse goods, but they were terrified of the cattle. The saga says that Karlsefni's bull came roaring out of the woods, and the Skraelings, who had never seen such an animal, fled in panic. The presence of the animals also created new kinds of work for the colonists. They needed to be protected from predators. They needed to be put out to pasture. The land around Meadows had wide grassy terraces perfect for grazing. The women would have milked the cows and ewes, churning butter and making skyr, a type of yogurt that was a staple of the Norse diet. The sagas mention that a key part of their trade with the Skraelings involved offering them milk products. The archaeological evidence from Meadows supports the presence of these animals. While no large animal bones have been found at the site, this is not surprising. The acidic soil of Newfoundland dissolves bone over time, but the layout of the settlement is telling. The buildings are surrounded by a large open area. Some archaeologists believe this area could have been a paddock, a fenced enclosure to keep the livestock safe at night. The very design of the longhouses, which in Iceland and Greenland often included a byre or stable at one end for sheltering animals in the winter, was adapted for a new context. Bringing livestock was a massive gamble. It made an already dangerous voyage even more complex and risky. But it showed the settlers' intent. They were not just there to harvest timber and grapes. They were there to stay. They were farmers and ranchers trying to replicate their Greenlandic home in a new, unknown land. The sound of a cow lowing on the shores of Newfoundland in 1010 AD was the sound of a people trying to tame a wilderness, to make it familiar, to make it home. Number 15. The first European American was a Viking baby. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjornardóttir. She was an Icelandic woman of remarkable resilience. By the time she joined Thorfinn Karlsefni's great expedition to Vinland, she had already been shipwrecked, widowed, and had traveled more than most people of her time. In Vinland, she would make history sometime during their first year at the settlement of Leifsbudir, likely in the year 1011 or 1012. Gudrid gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson. He was a healthy baby born thousands of miles from his parents' homeland, and he was the first person of European descent to be born in the Americas. His first cries were heard not in a stone church in Norway or a turf house in Iceland, but in a new green world on the shores of a lake in Newfoundland. His childhood was unlike any other. He spent his first 3 years in Vinland. He would have been raised by a community of settlers living on the edge of the known world. His world would have been the longhouse, the nearby woods, and the river. His playmates would have been the few other children on the expedition. He would have seen the strange faces of the Skraelings who came to trade. He would have heard the sounds of their language, so different from the Old Norse his parents spoke. He was a child of two worlds, born in one but belonging to the other. The sagas do not say much about his early life, but they make it clear that his existence was central to the story of the settlement. The birth of a child was a powerful sign. It meant the colony had a future. It meant they were not just visitors, but pioneers. A settlement with children is a settlement that plans to stay, but Snorri's birthplace was also a place of growing danger. The relationship with the Skraelings was unstable. It began with peaceful trade, the Norse offering milk and red cloth for rich furs. But misunderstandings and violence soon followed. The sagas tell of a battle in which the Skraelings attacked the settlement. It became clear that this small band of colonists could not defend themselves forever. They were too few and they were too far from home. When Snorri was 3 years old, Thorfinn Karlsefni made the difficult decision to abandon the colony. The risk was too great. They packed up their belongings, loaded their ships, and sailed back to Greenland, and then on to Iceland. Snorri, the first American-born European, left the continent of his birth, never to return. He grew up in Iceland on his father's estate at Glambar. He became a farmer and a chieftain. He had his own children, a son named Thorgeir and a daughter named Hallfrid. Snorri lived a long life and became an important man in Iceland. He was a living link to the Vinland adventure. People would have looked at him and known he was born in that fabled faraway land, and his legacy continued. Through his children, he became the ancestor of several prominent Icelanders, including 3 bishops of the Icelandic Church in the 12th and 13th centuries. The story of Vinland was passed down through his family. It is very likely that the sagas, which were written down a few generations later, were based in part on the oral traditions preserved by Snorri and his descendants. The memory of the settlement where he was born was kept alive because of the boy who came from there. He was not just the first European American. He was the reason we know the story at all. Number 14. They fought the first war between Europeans and Native Americans. The first meeting was peaceful. The sagas describe the Norse settlers, led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, seeing a large number of canoes approaching their camp at Leifspedir. The people in the canoes were the native inhabitants of the land. The Norse called them Skraelings, a term that likely meant dwarfs or wretches, a dismissive name for people they did not understand. The Skraelings were described as small, with threatening eyes and broad cheekbones. The Skraelings were just as curious about the Norse. They landed their canoes and stared at the strange, tall people with their pale skin and hair, their woolen clothes, and their bizarre livestock. Neither side understood the other's language. They communicated through gestures. The Norse, wanting to establish a peaceful relationship, offered them goods for trade. And Karlsefni forbade his men from trading their weapons, their swords and axes. Instead, they offered dairy products and red cloth. The Skraelings were fascinated by the milk, and they were especially eager to get the red cloth, which they would tie around their heads as a sign of status. In return, they offered the Norse what they had in abundance: valuable furs, gray fur, sable, and all kinds of pelts. The trade was a success. The Skraelings came back again and again, and a peaceful, if wary, relationship was established. But the peace was fragile. It was broken by a combination of fear and misunderstanding. During one trading session, Karlsefni's bull got loose. It ran out of the woods, roaring. The Skraelings, who had never seen a bovine animal, were terrified. They dropped their goods and fled to their canoes. They did not return for 3 weeks. When they did, it was not for trade. They came back as a war party. The sagas say a great number of canoes came from the south, like a streaming river. The Skraelings swarmed ashore, armed with bows and arrows. A battle began. The Norse were heavily outnumbered. They fought bravely, but were forced to retreat up a narrow cliff face where they could better defend themselves. It was in this battle that Freydis Eriksdottir, Leif's half-sister, showed her fierce character. As the Norsemen retreated, Freydis, who was pregnant at the time, could not keep up. And she shouted at them, "Why do you run from such wretches, brave men like you? I think you could slaughter them like cattle. If I only had a weapon, I am sure I could fight better than any of you. She saw a dead Norseman on the ground with his sword beside him. She grabbed the sword. As the Skrælings advanced on her, the saga says she pulled one of her breasts from her tunic and slapped the sword with it. This bizarre and fearsome display terrified the Skrælings. They stopped their advance and retreated to their canoes. Freydis's shocking act of defiance had saved the Norse from being overrun. This was the first battle between Europeans and indigenous people in North America. It was a short, brutal, and decisive conflict. Although the Norse had won the immediate fight, they had lost the war. They realized they could never live in peace in Vinland. Karlsefni is quoted in the saga as saying, "It seems to me that though the land is a good one, we will always have to live with the threat of war and trouble with the people who live here already." They were too few, and the Skrælings were too many. They were isolated, a tiny island of Norse culture in a vast continent that belonged to someone else. The dream of a permanent colony died in that battle. It was the beginning of the end for the Norse in America. Number 13, they left because they were outnumbered. The Norse who tried to settle Vinland were some of the toughest people on Earth. They were warriors, farmers, and sailors who had survived the brutal conditions of Iceland and Greenland. They were not easily frightened, but in Vinland they met a challenge they could not overcome. It was not the climate or the land. It was the people who were already there. The decision by Thorfinn Karlsefni to abandon the colony at Leifspedir after 3 years was a military one. It was a strategic retreat after their first violent clash with the Skrælings. The Norse lived in a state of constant fear. They were a small group, perhaps 160 people at their peak, including women and children. They were isolated thousands of miles from any hope of reinforcement. The Skrælings, on the other hand, were on their home ground. Their numbers were, for all practical purposes, unlimited. The Norse had a technological advantage. They had iron weapons, swords, axes, and spears. The Skrælings used bows and arrows with stone or bone points and stone axes. In a one-on-one fight, a Norse warrior in a mail shirt with an iron sword was far superior to a Skræling warrior. But battles were not fought one-on-one. The Skrælings had overwhelming numbers. The saga describes their war party arriving in a fleet of canoes, so numerous it looked like a flowing river. They could absorb losses in a way the Norse could not. Every Norseman killed was a catastrophic loss for the small community. The Norse settlement was a fixed target. It was a cluster of turf houses on a coastal terrace. The Skrælings were mobile. They knew the land, the rivers, the forests. They could attack at will and then disappear back into the vast interior of the continent. The Norse were trapped, forced into a defensive posture. They could not farm or hunt or even gather wood without the constant threat of ambush. Life became a siege. The psychological toll would have been immense. Every strange noise in the forest, every shadow at dusk would have been a source of anxiety. They were an island in a hostile sea. The sagas capture this feeling. Karlsefni concluded that they could not stay. The land was good, he admitted. There was timber, grazing land, and food, but the price of holding it was too high. It would mean a perpetual state of war, a life of fear and bloodshed. It was not a viable way to build a new society. This was a new experience for the Norse. In Iceland, the land had been empty when they arrived. In Greenland, they had settled in the uninhabited fjords, far from the small Inuit populations in the north. In Vinland, for the first time, they came face to face with a large, established population that was willing and able to defend its territory. They were not conquerors with a large army. They were farmers looking for a better place to live, and they realized that place could not be Vinland. So they left, they packed their children, their remaining livestock, and their few possessions onto their ships and sailed away. They chose the harsh, familiar safety of Greenland over the rich, dangerous promise of Vinland. The fundamental reason the Viking Age in America ended was a simple matter of demographics. The Norse were a handful of pioneers, the Skrælings were a nation. Number 12. A single piece of thread proved women were there. For a long time after the Ingstads discovered the ruins at Meadows, a key piece of the Vinland puzzle was missing. The sagas spoke of women and families. They told the story of Gudrid and her son Snorri. They described Freydis leading an expedition. They were clear that these were not just temporary camps for male explorers, but attempts at colonization. But for decades, the archaeological evidence couldn't fully support this. The artifacts found were mostly masculine: a blacksmith's tools, a cloak pin, nails for a ship. These things could have belonged to an all-male crew on a timber-gathering mission. The evidence for women was circumstantial. The longhouses were large enough for families. The presence of a smithy suggested a long-term stay, which made families more likely. But there was no definitive physical proof that women had walked on that patch of ground 1,000 years ago. That changed with the discovery of a single, small, unassuming object, a spindle whorl. It was found during the excavations in the 1960s. It's a small circular piece of soapstone about 1.5 inches in diameter, with a hole drilled through the center. It's not an impressive artifact. It looks like a stone donut, but its significance was enormous. A spindle whorl is a weight. It's attached to the bottom of a wooden spindle. When spinning wool into yarn, the spinner would draw out a few fibers from a bundle of wool, twist them, attach them to the spindle, and then give the spindle a sharp twist. The whorl acts as a flywheel, keeping the spindle rotating and twisting the fibers into a consistent thread. In Norse society, spinning was exclusively women's work. It was a fundamental part of a woman's role in the household. Men worked with wood and iron, they sailed and they fought. Women managed the farm, raised the children, and produced textiles. They spun the wool from their sheep into yarn, and then wove that yarn into the cloth needed for sails, blankets, and all of their clothing. Finding a spindle whorl at a Norse site is like finding a lipstick at a modern campsite. It is irrefutable proof of the presence of women. The Lance o Meadows spindle whorl was a direct physical link to the women of the sagas, to Gudrid and Freydis, and the other unnamed women who made that incredible journey. It meant that on those cold Newfoundland nights 1,000 years ago, a woman sat by the fire in the longhouse, her hands busy with the familiar rhythmic task of spinning. It was a piece of domestic life, a piece of home that they had carried with them across the ocean. The whorl also told another story. It was made of soapstone, a material found in Greenland and Iceland, but not locally at Meadows. This meant the woman who owned it had brought it with her. It was a personal possession, a vital tool for her work, important enough to be packed for the long and dangerous voyage. It connected the settlement not just to women, but to a specific origin. This one small stone object transformed the interpretation of the site. Lance o Meadows was no longer just a camp for Viking explorers. It was a home, a place where a complete society with men, women, and children tried to put down roots. It confirmed the accuracy of the sagas in a way no weapon or tool ever could. It was the quiet, domestic evidence of a family's dream. Number 11, Vinland might not mean wineland. The name itself, Vinland, has shaped our image of the Norse discovery for centuries. It conjures up images of a paradise, a land of warmth and abundance, where wild grapes grew so plentifully that Leif Erikson's crew could fill their ship with them. The sagas are explicit about this. They tell the story of Turkur, Leif's German foster father, finding the grapes, and Leif naming the land Vinland as a result. This discovery of wine grapes has been used by historians to pinpoint the location of Vinland, suggesting it must have been in a region with a climate warm enough for grapes to grow, like New England or even further south. But the physical evidence doesn't quite line up. The only confirmed Norse settlement is at Lance Meadows in Newfoundland. Now, wild grapes do not grow that far north today, and even with the slightly warmer climate of the medieval warm period, it's highly unlikely they ever did. This has created a major puzzle. If Lance Meadows is part of Vinland, where are the vines? One possibility is that Lance Meadows was just a gateway, a base camp. From there, the Norse sent out smaller expeditions further south to the grape-growing regions. The discovery of butternut wood at the site, a type of tree that doesn't grow in Newfoundland, proves they did travel further south, at least to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So perhaps they did find grapes on one of these trips, but there is another more intriguing theory. What if Vinland doesn't mean Winland at all? The Old Norse language had two different words that sound like Vin. One, with a long e-vowel vin, does mean wine, but another, with a short e-vowel vin, means something completely different. Well, it means pasture or meadow. This second meaning changes the entire picture. If Leif Erikson named the land Vinland, he was not naming it for a luxury fruit. He was naming it pasture land or meadow land. This name fits the landscape of L'Anse aux Meadows perfectly. It is a place of wide, grassy, marine terraces, ideal for grazing livestock. For a society of pastoral farmers from the harsh, overgrazed lands of Greenland, a place with vast, lush pastures would have been a discovery of immense value, perhaps even more valuable than wild grapes. This interpretation was first proposed by the Swedish philologist Sven Soderberg in the early 20th century and has been debated ever since. If it's correct, it means the story of Tyrker and the grapes in the sagas might be a later embellishment, a piece of literary flourish added to make the story more exciting, and the new land seem more like a mythical paradise. It might have been a way for the saga writers to explain a name whose original meaning had been forgotten. The name Meadowland is much more in keeping with the other practical, descriptive names the Norse gave to the new territories Helluland Slab Land and Markland Forest Land. Slab land, forest land, and meadowland. It creates a logical, practical sequence. We may never know for sure what Leif Erikson intended. Was he a lucky explorer who found a vintner's paradise, or a practical farmer who found a rancher's dream? The ambiguity of a single vowel in a 1,000-year-old language keeps the mystery alive. But the possibility that Vinland meant meadowland forces us to see the Norse settlement in a new light. It wasn't about finding a quick treasure like wine. It was about finding a sustainable future, a place to raise their families and graze their cattle. It was about finding good land. Number 10, Greenland was their launching pad, and it was dying. To understand why the Norse went to Vinland, you have to understand where they came from. Their base of operations was not the prosperous heartland of Scandinavia. It was Greenland, the most remote and marginal colony in the entire Norse world. It was a settlement living on a knife's edge, and by the time Leif Erikson sailed west, it was already facing a slow, creeping crisis. Erik the Red founded the Greenland colony around 985 AD. He attracted settlers from overpopulated and resource-poor Iceland with a clever marketing trick. He called the new land Greenland, suggesting it was a fertile and welcoming place. In reality, only a few narrow fjords on the southwestern coast were habitable. The rest was a massive, barren ice cap. The settlers established two main colonies, the larger eastern settlement and the smaller western settlement. At its peak, the population may have been around 2,500 people. Life in Greenland was incredibly hard. They were farmers, but they couldn't grow grain. The growing season was too short. They survived by raising cattle, sheep, and goats, which they had to keep indoors for most of the year, feeding them precious stored hay. Their diet was heavily supplemented by hunting. They hunted caribou on land and, most importantly, seals and walruses in the sea. The colony's survival depended on trade with Europe. Greenland had only one valuable export luxury goods from the Arctic. They would sail north on long, dangerous hunting expeditions to a place they called Nordsatur. There, they hunted walruses for their ivory tusks and tough hide, which was used to make rope. They also hunted polar bears for their pelts. These goods, ivory, rope, and furs were traded with merchants from Iceland and Norway. In exchange for essentials, they could not produce themselves iron for tools and weapons, grain for bread and beer, and timber for building ships and houses. There were no trees in Greenland, only scrubby birch and willow. They were completely dependent on imported wood and driftwood. This trade was their lifeline, but it was a fragile one. As the 11th and 12th centuries progressed, that lifeline began to fray. The climate started to change. The medieval warm period, which had made the settlement of Greenland possible, began to wane. The Little Ice Age was setting in, sea ice became more prevalent, making the voyage to and from Europe more difficult and dangerous. Trade ships came less frequently. The resources in Greenland were also being depleted. Centuries of grazing had led to soil erosion. The caribou herds were shrinking. The walrus hunting grounds were far to the north, requiring ever longer and riskier expeditions. The colony was slowly being strangled. This was the context for the Vinland voyages. The Greenlanders were not expanding from a position of strength. They were searching for a solution to a growing problem. Markland, the forest land, was a potential answer to their critical timber shortage. A single voyage to Markland could bring back more wood than years of waiting for a trade ship or combing the beaches for driftwood. In Vinland, the Meadowland offered a better climate, longer growing seasons, and vast pastures for their livestock. It was a potential escape route. The Vinland settlement was a desperate gamble by a community that could see the writing on the wall. They were looking for resources, for a safety valve, for a place that could offer a more secure future than their icy home. The push west was not driven by a thirst for adventure. It was driven by the cold, hard calculus of survival. They were looking for a new Greenland, a better Greenland, before the one they had failed completely. Number 9, their ships were masterpieces of design. The Norse were able to cross the North Atlantic because they had a secret weapon, their ships. The Viking Age was defined by its naval technology. The iconic image is the longship, the sleek, dragon-headed warship used for raiding. But the discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland were not made in longships. They were made in a different kind of vessel, a less glamorous but far more important ship called the Nar. The Nar was the cargo ship of the Viking world, the equivalent of a modern freighter. It was designed for long, open ocean voyages, carrying heavy loads of cargo, people, and livestock, where the longship was long, narrow, and built for speed and maneuverability in coastal waters. The Nar was shorter, wider, and deeper. It had a much higher freeboard, meaning its sides rose higher out of the water, making it more seaworthy and better able to handle the massive waves of the North Atlantic. A typical Nar was about 54 feet long and 15 feet wide. It could carry a cargo of up to 24 tons. This incredible capacity was achieved through a revolutionary construction method. The hull was built using clinker construction, where the planks of the hull overlapped each other like siding on a house. These planks were split from green oak logs, not sawn. This meant the grain of the wood followed the shape of the plank, making it incredibly strong and flexible. The planks were fastened together with iron rivets. The real genius of the design was the internal frame. The ribs of the ship were not rigidly spiked to the hull planks. Instead, they were lashed to them with ropes made of spruce root or animal sinew. These lashings were threaded through cleats carved into the inside of the hull planks. This created a hull that was not rigid, but semi-flexible. When the ship was hit by a large wave, the hull could twist and bend slightly, absorbing the shock instead of breaking. The ship moved with the water rather than fighting it. It was this flexibility that allowed a relatively small wooden boat to survive the monstrous storms of the North Atlantic. The Nar had a single large square sail made of wool. This sail was its primary engine. It was not a fast ship, probably averaging about 5 to 10 knots, but it was incredibly efficient when sailing with the wind. For steering, it didn't have a modern central rudder. Instead, it used a large steering oar called a side rudder or steerboard, the origin of the word starboard, mounted on the right side of the ship near the stern. The crew of a Nar on a transatlantic voyage would have been small, perhaps 15 to 30 people, to leave maximum room for cargo. They lived and slept in the open boat with only a small tent-like structure for shelter. It was a wet, cold, and miserable existence. They were sailors, but they were also master craftsmen. They had to be able to repair a sail, a mast, or the hull in the middle of the ocean. Without the Nar, the Norse Atlantic adventure would have been impossible. It was the perfect tool for the job. It was strong enough to carry colonists and their cattle, flexible enough to survive the storms, and large enough to bring back the timber from Markland that was so vital to the Greenland colony. The ship itself was as important a discovery as the lands it reached. It was the key that opened the door to the New World. Number 8, the most traveled woman of the Middle Ages was a Viking. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, and her life story, as told in the sagas, reads like an epic adventure. She was not a queen or a noblewoman, but the daughter of an Icelandic farmer, yet, through a combination of fate, marriage, and an indomitable will, she became arguably the most widely traveled woman of her era. Her journeys spanned the entire known Norse world, from Scandinavia to the edges of North America and even to the heart of Christian Europe. Her story begins in Iceland. As a young woman, she traveled with her father to Greenland to join Erik the Red's new colony. The voyage was a nightmare, their ship was blown off course and they were lost at sea for months. Half of the passengers and crew died of disease and starvation before they finally limped into a remote fjord in Greenland. In Greenland, she married Thorstein Eriksson, the son of Erik the Red. Soon after, Thorstein mounted an expedition to sail to Vinland to recover the body of his brother Thorvald, but the voyage was a failure. They were battered by storms and never reached their destination. They returned to Greenland, where Thorstein died of a sickness that winter. Gudrid was now a widow in a strange, harsh land. Her life changed when she married a wealthy and ambitious Icelandic merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni. It was with Karlsefni that she embarked on her most famous journey, the great colonization attempt in Vinland. She was one of the key women in the expedition of 3 ships and 160 people. She lived in Vinland for 3 years. It was there she gave birth to her son Snorri, the first European born in the Americas. She experienced the peaceful first contact with the Skrælings, and she witnessed the violent conflict that eventually drove the Norse away. After the failure of the Vinland colony, Gudrid did not simply settle down. She, Karlsefni, and the young Snorri sailed from Vinland back to Greenland. From Greenland, they sailed to Norway to sell their goods, and from Norway, they finally returned to Iceland, where they bought a large farm at Glombyr. Gudrid had completed a full circle of the North Atlantic, a journey of thousands of miles through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. But her travels were still not over. After Karlsefni died and Snorri had grown up and taken over the farm, Gudrid found a new purpose. She had converted to Christianity earlier in her life, and now, as an old woman, she decided to make a pilgrimage. She set out from Iceland one last time. She traveled south, likely through Norway and Denmark, then down through the heart of Europe. Her destination was Rome, the center of the Christian faith. For an elderly woman in the 11th century to make such a journey is almost incomprehensible. It was a perilous trip on foot and by ship through foreign lands where she did not speak the language, but she made it. She met with church officials in Rome, perhaps even the Pope himself. She was a woman who had been born in Iceland, lived in Greenland, given birth in North America, and now stood in the heart of the ancient Roman Empire. After her pilgrimage, she returned to Iceland. The saga says she lived out the rest of her days as a nun and a hermit in a small church that her son Snorri had built for her. Her life had been a series of incredible journeys, pushing the boundaries of the known world. She was a pioneer, a mother, and a pilgrim. Her travels gave her a perspective on the world that was unique for her time, and perhaps for any time. Number 7, navigating the open ocean was an art form. The Norse sailors who crossed the Atlantic to Vinland did so without any of the navigational tools we consider essential. They had no magnetic compass that would not arrive in Europe for another couple of centuries. They had no sextant, no GPS, and no accurate maps. Their maps were stories, verbal descriptions of coastlines and sailing directions passed down from one captain to another. Yet they managed to navigate thousands of miles of open, featureless ocean with remarkable accuracy. They did it by turning their entire world into a compass. Their primary tool was the sun. On a clear day, they could determine their direction with reasonable accuracy. At midday, the sun is at its highest point in the sky, and in the northern hemisphere, it is due south. So they knew where south was. By observing the sun's position at sunrise and sunset, they could determine east and west. They likely used a simple device called a sun compass or sun shadow board. This was a wooden disc with a central pin, or gnomon. By marking the length of the gnomon's shadow throughout the day, they could find the shortest shadow, which occurs at local noon, and thus find a true north-south line. This allowed them to hold a steady course. They also used the sun to determine their latitude, how far north or south they were. They knew that the height of the midday sun above the horizon changes with latitude. The further north you go, the lower the sun is in the sky. By measuring the length of the noon shadow on their sun compass, or by observing the height of the sun against a familiar landmark on the ship, like the top of the rail, they could maintain a constant latitude. The voyage from Norway to Greenland, for example, was often made by sailing west from Bergen until they hit a certain latitude, and then just sailing west along that line of latitude until they hit Greenland. This was called latitude sailing. At night, they used the stars. The North Star Polaris was their fixed point. As long as they could see it, they knew where north was. They understood the constellations and how they moved across the sky throughout the night and throughout the seasons. But what happened when it was cloudy? The North Atlantic is famous for its fog and persistent cloud cover. For days on end, the sun and stars could be completely obscured. This is where the Norse may have had a secret tool, a near-magical device mentioned in the sagas the Sunstone. The sagas speak of a solar Stine, a crystal that could be used to find the sun's position even on a cloudy day. For a long time, this was dismissed as fantasy, but scientists now believe the sunstone was real. It was likely a piece of calcite crystal, specifically a type known as Iceland spar, which is common in Scandinavia. This crystal has a property called birefringence. It splits a beam of light into two separate rays. By rotating the crystal and looking at the sky through it, a navigator can find the one direction where the two images of the sky seen through the crystal have equal brightness. This direction points directly towards the hidden sun. It is a simple but effective way to find the sun's bearing even through thick clouds. While no sunstone has ever been definitively identified from a Viking shipwreck, the science is sound, and it provides a plausible explanation for how they navigated in foul weather. Beyond their tools, the Norse were master observers of nature. They read the ocean swells, which maintain a consistent direction over long distances. They observed the flight paths of birds, knowing that certain species fly out to sea to feed in the morning and return to land in the evening. Sighting a bird could indicate the direction of the nearest land. They could identify land smell on the wind. They watched for changes in the color of the water and the types of clouds, which can indicate land over the horizon. They even paid attention to whales, whose migration routes often follow coastlines. They were not just sailing on the ocean, they were reading it, listening to it, and using every clue it offered to find their way. Number 6, a single nut proves they explored far to the south. The settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland is the only confirmed Norse site in North America. For a long time, this presented a major problem for reconciling the archaeology with the sagas. The sagas call the new land Vinland, a place of wild grapes. But grapes do not grow in Newfoundland. This led to a question: was Meadows the main settlement described in the sagas? Or was it just a northern outpost, a base camp for explorations further south into the true grape-growing Vinland? The answer came not from a grand structure or a metal artifact, but from a handful of humble tree nuts. During the excavations at Meadows, archaeologists found several butternuts, also known as white walnuts, and pieces of butternut burl wood. This was a startling discovery. Butternut trees, juglans, cinerea do not grow in Newfoundland. Their natural habitat is much further south. The nearest place they grow is in the St. Lawrence River Valley and in New Brunswick, several hundred miles to the south of Meadows. These nuts could not have floated to the site. They are not buoyant. They could not have been carried there by birds. They could only have been brought there by people. The Norse who lived at Lance Meadows must have traveled south, discovered a land where butternut trees grew, gathered the nuts and wood, and brought them back to their northern base. This was a critical piece of evidence. It proved that Lance Meadows was not the full extent of the Norse world in America. It was exactly what the sagas described a base camp, Leifsbudir, from which the Norse launched further exploratory voyages. They were not static settlers, they were actively mapping and sampling the resources of this new continent. The butternuts tell a story of these expeditions. We can picture a small party of Norsemen, perhaps in a small boat, sailing south from their main camp. They would have followed the coast, exploring the bays and rivers of what we now call the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They would have seen a landscape that grew richer and more temperate the further south they went. They would have encountered the butternut trees, a species they had never seen before. They likely tasted the nuts and found them good to eat. They would have also recognized the value of the wood, especially the burls, the gnarled decorative growths on the tree, which were highly prized by woodworkers for making beautiful bowls and other objects. They gathered these resources and brought them back north. The nuts were found in a part of the site associated with refuse, suggesting they were eaten and the shells discarded. The burl wood was found near one of the workshops, indicating it was being worked on by a craftsman. The butternuts solved the Vinland grape mystery. It is entirely plausible that on these southern voyages, the Norse reached areas where wild grapes did grow. The northern limit for wild grapes, Vitis riparia, overlaps with the southern range of the butternut tree. A journey that took them to the butternuts could easily have also taken them to the vines. They could have gathered grapes, or perhaps just the knowledge of them, and brought it all back to Lance Meadows. The name Vinland might not apply to Newfoundland itself, but to the entire region they explored, a region whose southern reaches were defined by grapes and butternuts. These small, dried nuts, buried for 1,000 years, are a powerful testament to the scope of Norse exploration. They prove that the settlers of Lance Meadows were not just clinging to a single spot on the coast. They were ranging far and wide, their curiosity and their search for resources pulling them ever deeper into the heart of the New World. Number 5, the name they gave the natives is a mystery. When the Norse first encountered the indigenous peoples of North America, they gave them a name, Skraeling. This is the word used consistently throughout the sagas to describe the natives of both Greenland and Vinland. But the true meaning of this name and what it tells us about the Norse attitude towards these people is a subject of intense debate. It is a 1,000-year-old ethnic slur, and its exact translation is lost to time. The word Skraeling appears to be related to the modern Icelandic word skrælna, which means to shrivel, dry out, or shrink. From this, one popular interpretation is that Skraeling meant something like shriveled ones or punny ones. This would suggest a name based on physical appearance, perhaps a comment on the natives' smaller stature compared to the typically tall Norsemen. It could also refer to the appearance of dried animal skins that the natives wore. If this is the meaning, it's a name born of contempt, a dismissive label for a people the Norse saw as physically inferior. Another interpretation links the word to the Old Norse word skra, which could mean skin. In this case, skraeling would mean skin wearers. This seems like a more neutral descriptive term, simply referring to the fact that the native people wore clothes made of animal hides, as opposed to the woven wool garments of the Norse. The third, and perhaps the most likely theory, connects skraeling to the Swedish word skral, which means weak, sickly, or scrawny. This would make the name a direct insult, translating roughly to wretches, weaklings, or savages. This interpretation fits well with the often hostile tone the sagas take when describing the natives. The saga of Erik the Red describes them as having threatening eyes and broad cheekbones. The sagas often portray them as treacherous and primitive, or a name like wretches would align with this worldview. It's important to remember that we only have the Norse side of the story. We have no idea what the indigenous people who were likely ancestors of the Beothuk in Newfoundland or the Mi'kmaq in the Gulf of St. Lawrence called the Norse. We don't know what they thought of these strange, pale invaders who arrived on their shores. We only know that the Norse lumped all the native peoples they met into this single, mysterious, and probably derogatory category. The name reveals the cultural chasm between the two groups. The Norse did not see the Skraelings as a nation or a collection of different tribes. They saw them as a single alien other. The name was a barrier, a way of defining the natives as fundamentally different from and inferior to themselves. This attitude likely contributed to the failure of their relationship. It's difficult to build a lasting peace with a people you have named the wretches. The word Skraeling is a ghost in the historical record. It's a reminder that this first contact was not a meeting of equals. It was a collision of two worlds that did not understand each other. The name itself, whatever its precise meaning, was the first word in a long and often tragic story of misunderstanding and conflict between Europeans and the native peoples of the Americas. Number 4, knowledge of Vinland survived for 400 years in Europe. The Vinland colony failed. The Norse settlers returned to Greenland and Iceland, and no further attempts at colonization were made. But the knowledge of the lands to the west did not disappear for centuries after the last Norse ship sailed away from North America. The memory of Vinland was kept alive, not just in the oral sagas of Iceland, but in the written records of mainstream European history. The first non-Norse mention of Vinland comes from a surprising source, a German church historian named Adam of Bremen. Around the year 1075, only about 60 years after the final Vinland expedition, Adam was writing a history of the Archbishopric of Hamburg. And to gather information, he traveled to the court of the Danish king Svein Estridsson. The king was a knowledgeable man, and he told Adam stories about the lands of the north. In his finished work, Adam of Bremen wrote that the king had told him of an island, discovered by many, out in the Atlantic Ocean. It is called Vinland, he wrote, because vines grow there of their own accord, making the most excellent wine. He also added that self-sown crops abound there, something he heard not from fabulous fancy, but from the reliable report of the Danes. This is an astonishing piece of information. It shows that within a single lifetime of Leif Eriksson's voyage, the story of Vinland had traveled from the remote farmsteads of Greenland and Iceland to the royal court of Denmark, and from there into one of the most important scholarly works of the time. For Adam, Vinland was not a myth. It was a known, if distant, part of the world. The knowledge persisted in Iceland. The Icelandic Annals, a collection of year-by-year historical records, contains several entries related to the New World. An entry for the year 1121 states that Bishop Erik of Greenland went in search of Vinland. This suggests that not only was Vinland still a known location, but that there may have been a Christian community there, or at least a need for a mission. We don't know what happened to Bishop Erik. He never returned, but his journey shows that travel between Greenland and North America may have continued, at least sporadically, for more than a century after Karlsefni's colony was abandoned. Another entry in the Annals for the year 1347 is even more specific. It records the arrival in Iceland of a small ship from Greenland. The ship had been to Markland, the forest land, but had been blown off course to Iceland on its return journey. The ship had a crew of 17 or 18 men. This is the last recorded voyage to North America from the Greenland colony. It tells us that for over 300 years, the Greenlanders continued to make the journey to Markland to get timber. These were not voyages of exploration or colonization. They were supply runs, essential for the survival of the timber-poor Greenland colony. These scattered references show that Vinland, Markland, and Helluland were not forgotten lands. They were on the mental map of the medieval Norse. They were part of their world, a known but hazardous frontier. The knowledge was preserved in maps as well. The Icelandic Skálholt map, though its original is lost and we only have a 16th century copy, shows the northern tip of Vinland as a promontory extending south from Greenland. By the 15th century, however, the link was broken. The Norse colony in Greenland collapsed, likely due to a combination of climate change, loss of contact with Europe, and possibly conflict with the Inuit. With the death of the Greenland colony, the practical knowledge of how to get to Vinland was lost. The voyages stopped. The memory faded, and Vinland retreated from history into myth. It would take another 500 years, and the work of Helge and Stine Ingstad to bring it back. Number 3. The climate was their ally, then their enemy. The entire Norse Atlantic saga, from the settlement of Iceland to the voyages to Vinland, was made possible by a lucky break in the weather. The Vikings expanded during a period known to climatologists as the medieval warm period, or the medieval climate anomaly. From roughly 900 AD to 1300 AD, the Northern Hemisphere, and particularly the North Atlantic region, experienced a period of relatively mild temperatures. It was not uniformly warm everywhere, but on average, the climate was warmer and more stable than the centuries that preceded it or followed it. This warmer climate was the Norsemen's greatest ally. It made their expansion possible. In Scandinavia, it meant better harvests and a growing population, which created the pressure to seek new lands. The warmer seas meant less sea ice, opening up the sailing routes of the North Atlantic. It's no coincidence that the settlement of Iceland in the late 9th century and Erik the Red's colonization of Greenland in the 980s happened during this favorable period. Greenland itself was the biggest beneficiary of this climate anomaly. The name Greenland, while certainly a piece of clever marketing by Erik the Red, was not a complete lie. During the medieval warm period, the coastal fjords where the Norse settled were greener and more productive than they are today. The warmer temperatures meant a longer growing season for the hay that was essential for their livestock. The seas were more open, allowing them to hunt for seals and walrus and maintain contact with Iceland and Europe. This warmer world made the Vinland voyages feasible. Less ice in the Davis Strait and Baffin Bay made the journey from Greenland to North America safer. The climate the Norse found in Vinland around the year 1000 was also mild. The sagas speak of winters with little frost and grass that remained green. This allowed their cattle to graze outside for longer, a huge advantage for farmers used to the long, harsh Greenlandic winters. The presence of butternuts and the possibility of wild grapes also point to a climate that was at least as warm, if not warmer, than today's. But climates are not static. Beginning around 1300, the medieval warm period began to fade. The world entered a new, colder, and more volatile climatic phase known as the Little Ice Age. For the Norse colonies in the North Atlantic, this was a death sentence. In Greenland, the effects were catastrophic. Temperatures dropped. The growing seasons for hay became shorter and less reliable. It became harder and harder to support their livestock through the increasingly long and brutal winters. The pastures degraded. On the sea, the ice expanded. The shipping lanes to Iceland and Norway, their lifeline for trade and communication, became choked with sea ice for longer periods of the year. Those ships could no longer reliably make the journey. The Greenlanders became isolated. The walrus hunting grounds to the north became inaccessible. This cut off their supply of ivory, their only valuable export. The economy collapsed. At the same time, the cooling climate seems to have shifted the migration patterns of the seals they relied on for food. Starvation became a real threat. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350. The larger eastern settlement clung on for a few more decades, but by the mid-15th century, it too was gone. The Norse of Greenland simply vanished. The Little Ice Age also slammed the door on North America. The sea route to Markland and Vinland, already dangerous, would have become nearly impossible to navigate. The dream of a new life in a warmer land to the west died with the climate that had made it possible. The Norse were a people of the sea, and their fate was ultimately tied to the temperature of that sea. The warmth had allowed them to reach the edge of the world. The cold drove them back and eventually consumed them. Number 2, a Christian prophetess foretold the journey. The story of the Norse in Greenland is not just one of tough farmers and daring explorers. It was also a society in the midst of a profound spiritual change. They arrived in Greenland as pagans, worshipping the old gods like Thor and Odin, but Christianity was sweeping across Scandinavia, and it followed them to the edge of the world. The sagas capture this tension between the old ways and the new faith, and one of the most vivid stories centers on a mysterious prophetess and a young Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, the future mother of the first European American. The story takes place in the western settlement of Greenland during a terrible famine. It was a long, hard winter, and the hunting had failed. People were starving. In one community, there was a woman named Thorbjorg. She was known as the Little Prophetess, and she was a seer, a practitioner of the old pagan magic known as Seder. In desperation, the local chieftain called on her to perform a ritual to see when the famine would end. And Gudrid was staying in this household at the time. She was a Christian and wanted nothing to do with the pagan ceremony. The ritual required a specific song to be sung, a chant called the Vardlakur, to summon the spirits. But no one in the house knew the song except for Gudrid. She had been taught it by her foster mother in Iceland as a child. The Thorbjorg and the chieftain begged Gudrid to sing. At first she refused. She said, "This is the sort of action in which I intend to take no part, because I am a Christian woman." But the chieftain persisted, arguing that she could help the community without compromising her faith. Finally, reluctantly, Gudrid agreed. The saga describes the scene in detail. Thorbjorg sat on a high platform, dressed in a blue cloak and a headdress of black lambskin lined with white catskin. The women of the household formed a circle around her. Gudrid then sang the chant. The saga says she sang it so beautifully that everyone present felt they had never heard a more beautiful voice. As she sang, the magic worked. Thorbjorg went into a trance. She said that the spirits had been drawn by Gudrid's beautiful song, spirits that had previously been turned away from the house. She then delivered her prophecy. She told the people that the famine would end soon, that spring would come, and the fishing and hunting would be good again. But then she turned to Gudrid. She looked at the young Christian woman who had enabled her pagan ritual, and she told her of her future. "I can now repay you for the help you have given us," the prophetess said. "Your destiny is now clear to me." She told Gudrid that she would make a great marriage there in Greenland, but that it would not last long. She foretold that Gudrid would then return to Iceland, and then came the most remarkable part of the prophecy, where Thorbjorg told her, "A great and goodly posterity shall spring from you, and over your descendants there shall shine a brighter ray than I have the power to see so clearly." She predicted a great lineage for Gudrid, a future filled with light. This prophecy, made in a starving Greenlandic settlement, was a direct foreshadowing of the Vinland story. And Gudrid's great marriage would be to Thorfinn Karlsefni. Her journey would take her to Vinland. Her great and goodly posterity would begin with her son Snorri, born in the New World. And her descendants would indeed be prominent, including several bishops who would be shining lights of the Icelandic Church. The brighter ray the prophetess could barely see was the future of a new branch of a family, a future that would begin on the shores of North America. The story shows how, in the Norse mind, the journey to Vinland was intertwined with destiny, fate, and the shifting tides of faith itself. Number 1. The Vinland map is a brilliant fake. For a brief period in the 1960s, it seemed like the world had not one, but two pieces of stunning proof of the Norse discovery of America. In 1960, the Ingstads uncovered the settlement at Meadows. Then, in 1965, Yale University announced the discovery of a map. It was called the Vinland map. It was a simple map of the world, supposedly drawn by a monk around the year 1440, more than 50 years before Columbus's voyage. And in the upper left-hand corner, out in the Atlantic Ocean, it clearly showed an island labeled Vinlanda Insula, the island of Vinland. The map was a global sensation. It showed Greenland, Iceland, and to the west of Greenland, a large landmass that looked remarkably like a stylized version of the coastline of northeastern North America. An inscription on the map described Vinland as having been discovered by Bjarni and Leif. If authentic, the map was proof that the knowledge of the New World was not just confined to obscure Icelandic sagas, but was part of the geographical understanding of educated Europeans in the 15th century. It suggested that Columbus was not sailing into a complete unknown, but towards a land that was, at some level, already on the map. The map's provenance was mysterious. It had been bound in a book with another medieval text, the Tartar Relation. An antiquarian book dealer named Lawrence Whitten had bought it in 1957 and sold it to a Yale alumnus, Paul Mellon, who then donated it to the university. Yale scholars spent years studying it in secret before the public announcement. They declared it to be authentic. The paper was medieval, the binding was medieval, the script was consistent with the 15th century, but from the very beginning there were doubts. Some scholars pointed out that the depiction of Greenland was suspiciously accurate. Medieval maps or Portoland charts were notoriously inaccurate for northern regions. The Vinland map showed Greenland as a correctly proportioned island. How could a monk in 1440 know that Greenland was an island, something not confirmed by modern explorers until the 19th century? The coastlines of Vinland itself also seemed too neat, too close to what a modern person might sketch from memory. The real controversy, however, centered on the ink. The ink used for the map's text and the ink used for the coastlines looked different. In 1972, a chemical analysis of the ink was performed by a team led by Walter Macrone, a renowned microscopist. His findings were explosive. The ink used to draw the outlines of Vinland and the other land masses contained anatase, a form of titanium dioxide. This was the smoking gun. Anatase in that particular crystalline form was not commercially produced as a pigment until the 1920s. It was a modern ingredient. Macrone declared unequivocally that the Vinland map was a forgery. The debate raged for decades. Yale University and its supporters fiercely defended the map's authenticity. They argued that the anatase could have come from the natural sands used to prepare the ink. They conducted their own tests. Other scientists weighed in on both sides. The map became one of the most contentious artifacts in the world. The final definitive answer came in 2021. A new team of researchers at Yale, using the latest high-tech scanning technology like X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, conducted the most exhaustive analysis to date. They were able to map the chemical composition of the entire document without damaging it. Their conclusion was inescapable. The brown lines of the map, the coastlines of Vinland, were indeed drawn with an ink containing titanium dioxide. But more damningly, they found that the text on the back of the map, which was known to be from an authentic medieval document, had been overwritten. The original Iron Gall ink had been chemically erased, and the Vinland map had been drawn over the top of it. They even found traces of the original text still visible beneath the forgery. The Vinland map was not a lost treasure of medieval cartography. It was a brilliant modern forgery, likely created in the 20th century by a highly skilled forger who took a genuine medieval manuscript and used it as a canvas for his deception. The dream was over. The map was fake. The real proof of the Viking discovery of America was not a line on a piece of parchment. It was the turf walls and iron nails buried in the soil of Newfoundland. It was the story told not by a clever forger, but by the quiet, undeniable evidence of archaeology.